have, as you know, three discussants, starting with Jean-Jacques Herings from University of Maastricht. So please, Jean-Jacques, you have the floor.
So let me start by saying that I feel really privileged to have the opportunity to discuss the lectures as given by Jacques DREZE. So in a sense, there are three heroes in my life. Two are Walloon, and one is from Brussels. One of them I've never met. One of them I met once and was sitting next to him in the airplane. And one of them I've met 100 times. So one of them is Georges Remy, better known as RG, whose books I love to read, and who lives not far away from Louvain, or used to live not far away from Louvain. So another one is also from my early childhood, which is Eddy Merckx. And the third one is Jacques DREZE. And usually, I'm very impressed by Jacques DREZE's ability to use insights from economic theory at its highest level to generate concrete recommendations for policy making. And therefore, I had high expectations when coming to Louvain. And indeed, this is an example, and perhaps this is the only example, where common, correct point expectations make sense, and where there is hardly any uncertainty about the prevailing state of nature. So these were not the first lectures which I have attended, which were given by Jacques. Those were in fact in 91 in The Hague, and I wrote a small article about it for Tilburg University, where I was a young PhD student at the time. And the content of these lectures actually was remarkably similar to today's lectures. And in fact, the conclusion at the end, namely a need for public policy to stimulate demand, was exactly the same. So at the time, being a young PhD student, there were many things which I didn't understand. But now, 25 years later, I think I understand everything you said. So I also learned a lot myself. Perhaps as a side remark, 1 year later, in the same place, in The Hague, I was also following lectures by Martin Helbig. So this was part of the training of Dutch PhD students. And so I had many conversations with Jacques about economics, and many of the keywords, many snapshots of topics also were lectured about these days. So things like common correct point expectations, incompleteness of preferences, the utility of a life, Arrow's deductibility theorem, the mutuality principle of Borg, cumulative averaging, peak load pricing. These are all things which we have discussed many, many times. And now, this week, everything was put together in one coherent framework of lectures. And I knew in advance that this coherence would be there, because I once read an interview published in Macroeconomic Dynamics of Jacques with Pierre de Hey and Omer Licandro, where the question was, this brings us to the diversity of your contributions to our science, from economic theory to economic policy, from econometrics to operations research, from general equilibrium to game theory, from microeconomics to macroeconomics. Why have you decided to extend your research in so many different areas? What are the connecting themes between this variety of research subjects? And then here comes your answer. There are actually two quite distinct answers to the question. This brings out a substantial unity underlying an apparent diversity, whereas the second accounts for the residual diversity. So as an economist primarily interested in real-world problems, my theoretical interests have been driven in part by the substantive theme of allocation under uncertainty, in part by the persistent desire to integrate theoretical advances into a unified approach, namely general equilibrium theory, a field that I taught at Louvain for 25 years. So I'm equally impressed by Jacques' ability to write so eloquently and with a great sense of humor. And so I cannot help thinking of his famous metaphor on the theory of the firm in general equilibrium theory, the opening paragraph of DREZE 85, a paper published in the Economics Journal. And it is as follows. The firm fits into general equilibrium theory as a balloon fits into an envelope, flattened out. Try with a blown-up balloon. The envelope may tear or fly away. At best, it will be hard to seal and impossible to mail. Instead, burst the balloon flat and everything becomes easy. Similarly with the firm and general equilibrium, though the analogy requires a word of explanation. So, the modeling of the firm in an integrated model of the economy, in my view, is one of the most outstanding research issues in economics. And part of this research question is how to model firms' decision criteria under incomplete markets. Now, my own view, and here I disagree a bit with Jacques, to understand firm behavior is that it is necessary to recognize that a firm consists of multiple decision makers, often with conflicting objectives. So Jacques sidestepped this issue and treated the firm as a decision maker with incomplete preferences. And I think it's an important modeling step, but I think ultimately we have to recognize that there are multiple decision makers within a firm. And so I guess the resulting preference relation, if you would try to summarize it in that way, would typically be intransitive. And I think that's not something that you allowed for, if I remember correctly. But anyhow. So, in a paper published by myself and Volker Britz, Arkady Protetshinsky and myself, we present a model in which the internal decision-making of the firm is formalized as a strategic bargaining game. So here the underlying reasons are the following. If markets are incomplete, then decision makers in a firm do not agree about the production plan which should be chosen. But that's, of course, all over the place in economics. I mean, buyers and sellers also disagree about the price they would like to receive or to pay for a commodity. And then the typical way that these conflicts are resolved is through processes of bargaining. So I thought it was a natural way to also treat the theory of the firm in an incomplete market setup, so have the owners negotiate the production plan that they want to choose. And so then we get a unique prediction for the production plan, as well as a system of transfer payments in terms of the good in period 0. Now we distinguish between two cases, complete markets and incomplete markets. And so what we derive is that for complete markets, the profit-maximizing production plan is the same as the one which would follow from the Arrow-Debreu model. However, because owners make use of their bargaining power to redistribute the profit among themselves, the utilities they receive would typically be different from the Arrow-Debreu prediction. Now, the other case would be the incomplete market case. And here the good news is that bargaining equilibria are constrained Pareto optimal. And so, therefore, they would be consistent with the use of what is known as the DREZE criterion. So, what this in a sense means is that the use of the DREZE criterion, which in your 74 paper I think was mainly introduced for also using normative reasoning, can also be derived from a more positive approach, like a bargaining approach between owners of the firm. Now, because the transfers which are made are typically non-zero, it means that the production plan which is adopted is different from the transfer-free pseudo-equilibrium as you defined it. But then, since you did not necessarily insist on the transfer-free pseudo-equilibria, but you define basically a set of pseudo-equilibria because you did not assign individual ownership rights, it would be consistent with the more general concept of a pseudo-equilibrium. So in a sense, I support your view of the use of the DREZE criterion in an incomplete market framework. So then if we look at the mortgage and financial crisis in the US in 2008, which launched a deep recession which is still affecting us seriously, I would say to understand this crisis, you should better understand the theory of the firm in a general equilibrium setup, because I think this crisis really is about the interaction between, say, corporate finance and incentives within the firm and its implications for the pricings of assets and the more global macroeconomy. And I think such a research program would also call for abandoning assumptions of complete information, absence of strategic behavior, and perfect monitoring of the agent actions. So I guess this is a research challenge that I would like to add. Then the other thing I would like to comment on is the multiplicity of equilibria, which was also a common theme of the lectures. So you presented the results based on the paper in economic theory published in 2016, where you have a multiplicity of temporary equilibria. And I saw some people being not completely happy with the temporary equilibrium approach. At least that was the part which raised most questions from the audience. So I think therefore it's important to point out that one can also do the same analysis in a model where everybody is rational and where you make the extreme assumption that there are common correct point expectations of all the individuals in the economy. So this is a paper which was also published in the same journal in 2014 by myself. So just to give you an outline of that model, it's quite similar to the one presented by Jacques. It's an extension of the Arrow-Debreu model in three ways. So the first one is following Arrow 53. We have a setting with sequentially opening markets for commodities as opposed to a complete set of contingent commodities. And so people trade Arrow securities from today to tomorrow, which give the possibility to hedge against uncertain future income shocks. And these Arrow securities in my model, and also in your model, I think, are paying out monetary amounts. So this is a nominal model. So an Arrow security will pay you 1 unit of money. The second extension of the Arrow-Debreu model is therefore following Klauer, that all the transactions you make of commodities are always against money. So you exchange a commodity labor against money, and you use money to purchase consumption goods. And this is done using a general monetary transaction technology in the spirit of DREZE and Polemarchakis. And then the third ingredient of the model is price stickiness, where at each daily event, a commodity either has a sticky price in nominal terms, which means that it is equal to the price of the predecessor state event, or the price of a commodity is flexible, which means that it will be determined endogenously by the forces of law of supply and demand, and therefore by market clearing. Now, just to stress the importance of price stickiness, there is a lot of empirical research measuring how sticky prices are. And what is found, if you look across all sectors in the economy, that the average price update, or I should say actually the median price update of commodities is once every year. So that means if a single day event would be 1 day, that would mean that 364 out of 365 date events would be such that the commodity has a sticky price, and only one where it has a flexible price. So different from your model, this would be a model with finally many time periods, any finite number of time periods, potentially very large. Now this is the economy. I'm not going over the details. And this is the concept of equilibrium. I don't want to go over the details, but I just want to emphasize that everybody has rational expectations. Commodity markets clear, security markets clear. There are no arbitrage possibilities. Accounting identities are satisfied, so the dividends has to do with the fact that households have shares in the banking sector, and the banks distribute their profits as dividends to the households. F refers to the price stickiness. Then G expresses that there is no rationing if prices are flexible, but of course there could be rationing at date events where the commodity price is sticky, because then the price cannot clear the market, and so there could be either supply rationing or demand rationing, which is also a difference with your talk yesterday, because you are, if I remember correctly, looking only at supply-constrained equilibria. Here I allow for both supply and demand rationing. And here comes the main result. So this is one for rational expectations. There is a huge multiplicity of equilibria. And in fact, what you can do, look, so S capital T is the number of terminal date events. So capital T is the final time period, say thousands of years away, if you like. And capital ST is all the number of possible date events 1,000 years away. So that's a huge set. Then I say, at every terminal date event, pick an arbitrary commodity and fix its price. So I have a degree of I have a dimension of multiplicity equal to the cardinality of this huge set ST. And now I say I can find a rational expectations equilibrium which delivers these prices at these terminal date events. Or in other words, the dimension of the set of rational expectations equilibria is equal to the cardinality of S sub capital T. Now you could say, okay, this could be all nominal indeterminacy, so we shouldn't care. And indeed, if there would be no price stickiness, this would be just nominal indeterminacy and we should not care. But under weak assumptions, certainly satisfied in reality, this whole dimension of multiplicity of equilibria has real effects. So all these equilibria are different in utility terms. Okay. I'm also making a comment. So Jacques was mentioning many papers published in the 30s of the last century. So I think one should also make a reference to Keynes, which was published in 36. To my surprise, you didn't mention him. But I really view these kind of results as demonstrating the possibility of equilibrium multiplicity as a result of self-fulfilling pessimistic expectations, and a demonstration that these things are compatible with general equilibrium models where agents optimize, where markets clear, and where accounting identities are respected. Now, what this also shows is that rational expectations are not sufficient to make reasonably sharp predictions. So then I think it's only natural to move to models of temporary equilibrium where there is more emphasis and more scope for expectation formation. Because how can you form rational, common, correct point expectations if you have to choose from a set which has this huge multiplicity? Now here comes another point where I disagree with Jacques. That is about the modeling of temporary equilibrium. So I don't disagree with your result, but I find the modeling approach of Belasco, which you also mentioned, more attractive. And my feeling is, using that framework, you get local uniqueness in the temporary equilibrium framework, which I would find attractive from a modeling perspective. And I guess if someone has to do it, it will have to be me. So I have to deliver on the promise to write it down. But I think it's by and large irrelevant, because I think under both specifications of temporary general equilibrium, as well as under general equilibrium with common correct point expectations, you will come to the same conclusion, which is that you would need public policies, and well-chosen and well-designed public policies. They are both apt and needed to select the current levels of the capital gap and the inflation rate. That's where I would like to conclude.
Jacques, do you want... You reply later? Okay, so now Martin Elwig.
The first impression that I received from Jacques was one of extraordinary friendliness, openness, and trust. And I think that that attitude must have been towards young researchers who were nobodies, must have been one of the secrets of your success. But it's not just a secret of success, it's also something that makes life in the profession, or maybe life in general, worth living. In listening to Jacques and reading through his slides, I was reminded of a statement by Paul Samuelson concerning Bob Solow. There are really two Bob Solows, and there are really two Jacques DREZEs. One is the high priest of formal economic theory, and the other is the hands-on, down-to-earth applied economist dealing with policy questions of the first order. And I can only emphasize or adapt Samuelson's comment. I like them both. The lectures provided us with an impressive synthesis of many of Jacques' own contribution, and some very interesting new results, and some strong policy recommendations. So what did they do? First of all, they're firmly grounded in general equilibrium theory at a time when general equilibrium theory seems to be all but forgotten by the profession. I think very welcome so. And the quote that Jean-Jacques had about the unified approach provided by general equilibrium theory confirms the importance of that element. General equilibrium theory is enriched with issues of expectations in a temporary general equilibrium model, rigidities of prices and wages, which are semi-endogenous but to some extent explained, and an attempt to relate the analysis to provide a stronger relation between micro and macro. Main findings: there is a multiplicity of equilibria, many of them not very efficient, and there are important policy implications. There is a wealth of ideas on many topics that I can't really go into them all. The approach to policy is very Pigouvian. The political economy side, what does the polity make of whatever proposal or whatever rules one installs, is not addressed, which is fine as far as it goes, but provides room for a caveat. And some of the policy recommendations I'm in strong agreement, in particular on public investment on efficiency grounds. And I'm always shocked when I see many of my German colleagues just say, government must be bad. The Hayekian tradition is proving very detrimental, not just for our profession, but also for our countries, to the extent that the profession has an influence. Sometimes I wonder whether crisis prevention in 2008-09 should not have been so successful. If we'd had something really on the order of 1933, we'd have much more discrediting of the Hayekian tradition in economics. I'm saying that full well knowing that this is cynical, and full well very happy that we have been able to reduce the extent of the recession. But I'm deeply worried about our profession's response. Now let me get to the proper substance of the talk. First, I want to relate the talk to the development of the discipline. As of 1970, we had something called the neoclassical synthesis. The Walrasian model reigned supreme, and Keynesianism was related to some practical problems of monopoly power, money illusion, and rigid wages. Then we had the wake-up call from Klauer and Leon Hufvud that there must have been more to Keynes than that. After all, he was a theorist and not just a pragmatist. So Klauer's question was, why does consumption depend on income? Income involves quantities, so presumably there must be some rationing. Leon Hufvud's observation, informational friction causes rigidities, and maybe these are what prevents price adjustment and gives rise to rationing. So maybe this is where we need to see the core of the Keynesian revolution. And then in the 70s, we got, of course, the formalization of much of this, in particular due to Jacques, and then also to Benassi and Barrow and Grossman, general equilibrium models with rigidities. And the model that we saw yesterday, to some extent, was an offspring of that kind of thinking. The profession in the US reacted very negatively. Why should prices be rigid? And if they are, that must be derived from optimization. So we got a whole generation of menu cost price adjustment papers, as if the postulate of a menu cost was any less ad hoc than the postulate of simply saying you can't adjust. And with the Calvo adjustment rule in the new Keynesian literature, we're basically back to rigidities, and we're basically back to the neoclassical synthesis, which provides a basis for understanding between microeconomists or real business cycle economists and Keynesian economists. The real business cycle economists say we win in theory, and we are right. And the new Keynesian economists say, but for practical matters, we have a lot of important things to say. As for expectations, the reaction was, why should expectations be exogenous? And isn't the multiplicity of equilibria that we get from a multiplicity of expectations problematic? So then we had the rational expectations equilibrium postulate and the Lucas critique, which are fine as far as they go, but if you think about what was the situation in September 2008, I see no scope for any rational expectations analysis of what people did after the Lehman bankruptcy. This was a shock, a black swan, and from what I've understood you to be saying, that was precisely the kind of situation that you were referring to when you talked about uncertainty and unforeseen events. That being said, I'm not convinced that we are yet where we should be in terms of theory. Now, the word theory itself is problematic because we don't have theories, we just have models. No one model, even the most general one, can fit everything. Models are just devices to enlighten us about certain insights. And we apply the insights outside the models. And this is one thing that worries me greatly. We have no professional routine for deciding how to choose which models and which insights are relevant in which situation. To go from empirical material to actual analysis. I have been confronted with this question on many occasions in work in competition policy, in work in financial regulation. I think it's very serious. Macroeconomics is, of course, an area where this difficulty quite often has not yet been perceived. The macroeconomic models quite often have sort of one-size-fits-all calibrations. Of course, the calibrations differ between you Keynesian and real business cycle economists, and this is what they disagree about, but they all know that this is the approach to take. There is a focus on current flows, a neglect of income dynamics, a neglect of money, a neglect of asset markets, and then there's something very odd. They all are agreed in seeming to believe that they know what is meant by a period. Income equation. Jacques wrote the budget equation yesterday, and on the income side, the resource side of the household budget equation, there was a term referring to the distribution of firms' profits. Of course, this is an old ritual in general equilibrium theory. We have it enshrined in the theory of value. Walras avoided the problem by assuming constant returns to scale. But how do households know this quantity? That's a very serious issue. Suppose that Jacques owns shares in a toy company, and I want to buy toys for my grandchildren. How does he know what demand to express? Maybe he wants to buy a sailing boat. His purchasing power for the sailing boat won't be clear to him until he knows the dividends from the toy company. Now, I happen to have shares in a sailing boat producer. Now, my demand for toys depends on how much I can buy, what profits I make from the sailing boats. You can see that there is a fixed point equilibrium problem in there, and it's one that we have never discussed. There is a very serious communication and coordination issue in every general equilibrium model the moment we talk about firms' profits. We always talk as if it was just a matter of coordinating markets through prices. But no, it's also through incomes. And in some cases, some endogenous growth models, where there is an assumption of Bertrand pricing thrown into a general equilibrium model, actually prices are rigid. Say the unit price of a good is equal to the unit cost of the second best producer. The equilibrating mechanism comes through adjustment in incomes and in income expectations, i.e. wealth. But we have no story about how this adjustment comes about. Is this relevant? Well, if I think about the dynamics of economies entering into recessions that I've observed, I've always observed the sequence of our sales drop. We've got to save on something. Not just on the household side, but also in the corporate sector, and even more pronounced in the public sector. And that's the way multiplier processes occur. I would submit that in a formal sense, the Keynesian IS equation, and I think one can make that actually precise, is just a reformulation of the condition in the Arrow-Debreu model that equilibrium profits as seen by households must coincide with equilibrium profits that firms actually make. It takes some relabeling, but never mind. So if this equilibrium condition is not satisfied, what happens? Well, somewhere plans will be inconsistent. How do people find out? Well, when incomes don't come up, does that make them violate the budget constraint? No. Because budget constraints in the real world are defined by the ability to pay, i.e. to have a means of payment at the moment when you want to buy something. We have a dynamic process of payments where people use money balances in order to provide buffers. And well, the dividends from this year's profits are going to be distributed next year, so the inconsistencies won't be found out until next year. Do we know anything about these error correction mechanisms? Unfortunately, not at the level of theory that Jacques presented yesterday. I'd dearly love to have that. Money. I loved the formulation that putting firms into general equilibrium theory is like putting a balloon into an envelope. Putting money into general equilibrium theory is like putting a balloon into an envelope. What's the role of money in transactions? How do we model that? I just mentioned, well, you have these payment flows that are the counterpart to purchases. Irving Fisher talked about the velocity of circulation, which matches that very well. Except we've forgotten about it and just said 1 over V is an indicator for the demand for money. Problem is, money is not something that you just hold. It's something that you hold and get rid of, and it circulates. How do we use our theory of demand in order to deal with it? In the standard discrete time model that we use for these, we treat money as an asset that we demand, and we use portfolio choice considerations to study them. Some disagreeable facts. In the absence of a cash in advance constraint, there is no equilibrium in which money has real value when there is also a bond that pays a perpetuity that pays a safe coupon. With a cash in advance constraint, the velocity of circulation is one which is very mechanical. The Allee-Baumol-Tobin model of determining transactions behavior and money holdings makes the timing of transactions exogenous but does not fit into any equilibrium theory. Who's the counterparty? Timing of different counterparties must be coordinated. How does that happen? We have non-existence of equilibrium because of the non-convexities involved. And when we use large numbers to smear out these non-convexities, we again get into problems of coordination. If all wages are paid on the first of the month, we have a peak load problem at the first of the month. The large numbers argument would suggest smear out those states. Does that mean that coordination on the first of the month is just an artifact of central bank intervention to get rid of the peak load problem? Would a laissez-faire system not work? We don't know. Money as an asset is a stock. Its functions are related to transactions flows. And those two things we cannot fit together. What is a period? In macro models, flows, a month, a quarter, a year, depends on the model. How about a minute, a day? I think any real macro person or any real production person would say, you're crazy. But for asset markets, some asset markets operate in real time. Money markets operate at least on a daily basis. And when we are talking about September 2008, we are talking about real time and daily events. You have Lehman Brothers not getting its overnight funding from money market funds, and that was the end of Lehman Brothers. You have a run on money market funds, and they have to withdraw from funding banks, again in a matter of days. You have banks trying to sell shares, stocks, anything they could make into cash. A real-time process, on a completely different timescale from the one we ordinarily think of for macroeconomic variables. Can we have macro models that allow for the difference in timescales? I have no idea, but I think that's a huge challenge. The alternative would be, and of course in micro, in I/O, we do that all the time. We use many different models that transport different insights in order, without worrying how precisely they fit together, without developing a super model. It works moderately well, even though it's unsatisfactory. Let me get back to the question, how do we decide what is relevant? Mario Draghi these days has one priority: fight deflation and get the banks to lend. That's very much a macro flow focused point of view. We see a weakness of aggregate demand, and we need to do something to get investment demand going. Greenspan in 1990 did something very different. He put the short rate at 4% when the long rate was still at 8%. He allowed the banks to play the yield curve for 3 or 4 years in the hope that they would eventually have such high profits that they would be recapitalized, and that would help the economy to get going. If the underlying problem today does not come from the ordinary circular flow of income, but comes from maladjustments in stocks, such as the level of debt, the level of assets, the lack of profitability, or you might say the de facto insolvency of the banks. Is the Draghi strategy the right one to pursue? Or does the Draghi strategy carry a risk that the problems are made worse because it impinges on the profitability of banks through all sorts of channels? I think the underlying conceptual problem is when we have different models of how the economy works, how the macroeconomy works, how do we decide which of them, which of the different insights is relevant for the policy situation that we're in?
Thank you very much, Pierre. I'm particularly pleased to be here today. I have a long-term relationship with Jacques. It has been a 35 years story that started very early in my career. In fact, many people here knows that I was trained as an engineer in applied mathematics in the uptown here, and I wanted to do MBA at the end of this undergraduate program, and in between I already saw that as an engineer I was allowed to apply to a few courses in economics, and I took, and my first course in economics that I took was the course General Equilibrium Theory by Jacques DREZE. It was in the fall of 1982, I think. And when I hear Jacques yesterday, and when I read his paper 2 weeks ago, that experiment remind me what I faced 4 decades ago, three and a half decades ago. That is, this course of general equilibrium theory, when you start with the Brouwer lemma, hyperplane separation theorem, welfare theorems, and all those things full of maths, linear algebra, all those things I was quite good, and I clearly had a comparative advantage compared to, because of my background as an applied mathematician, compared to my colleagues who were students from economics.
You're a teacher.
No, I'm not sure. And so I was very happy, and I think until the end of November, while I was able to be bright, raising good questions to my teacher during the period. And then end of November, I started to look at the exams of the previous years. And I faced a big problem because these exams were nothing about the math. Typically the question was, suppose that we block the rents for students on the campus, what's the consequence? Are you for or against? Wow. And so, that's where you realize that the math that they are behind on the blackboard, that corresponds to the real world. There is something that tells you something about the real world. And for me, as a mathematician, that was completely new. And you know what? This is a lesson that I keep all my life. Since then, I realized that, the theorem is not the end, it's just the beginning. From the theorem, you need to go next and try to better understand the real world and use those new knowledge in order to help the society to be better. And so I learned that 35 years ago, and I also learned that here yesterday and today. Clearly you see the very nice interaction, and I think Jacques is the best teacher that I ever saw doing exactly that, the interaction between being a good theorist and also helping decision maker to make better decisions. So, just for the end of the story here, hopefully at the end of November of the fall of 1982, Jacques recommended reading this book. And in this book, we had also many applications of general equilibrium and looking at, peak load pricing and rent and things like that. So I was able to succeed to the exam eventually, and after that, I asked Jacques a letter of recommendation for my MBA, and he told me, no, you should not do MBA. You should do a PhD with me, and that's what I did, and I will never regret that. Okay, so let me now say a few words about the lecture. So my summary of what I learned yesterday and today is that, we know that because marketing completeness, temporal equilibrium may be very inefficient. And inefficiencies at the same time, productive inefficiencies and also inefficiencies in the allocation of risk in the economy. And because there is inefficient risk sharing in the economy, economic agent will be too risk averse, too prudent. That will generate a reduction in growth, reduction in investment, increase in unemployment. Moreover, because there is no price for in many dimensions, firms are allowed to form unrealistic expectation, and that may generate a financial crisis. And that's the most important thing, I think, in those in those equilibrium mechanisms, there is no endogenous corrective systems, okay? And so that's require public intervention. So since the financial crisis in 2008, we are in such a situation. What Jacques conclude from this is that from the theory side, we need it's a recommendation for a new wave in research in general economic theory with incomplete market, and I would also add considering asymmetric information, because I think that most of the market incompleteness come from asymmetric information problem. Okay, you cannot insure, again, many of the risk on your human capital just because that would generate moral hazard problem, and therefore there is no insurance for that kind of risk. So that's on the theory side, and I concur. On the policy recommendation, simulate aggregate demand and macro expectation, yes, and improve risk-sharing arrangement, like, implementing important reforms in the governance of the European Union, and at the more national level, implementing different fiscal reforms, for example. Okay. So, I learned from Jacques the importance of uncertainties, the role of uncertainty in the working of our economy. One of the big things that I learned from Jacques too is, that was in the 80s when I was his PhD student. Jacques was working a lot and making what's quite voiceful on reducing the debt burdens of different developing countries on the basis of the Borg theorem. Okay, if you look at the growth rate of different economies over the last 40 years, from 1969 to 2008, on average, the GDP per capita grows by 250%, basically, with a lot of different across different countries. So the destiny of different national economies has been very different from the well-known, the very well-known success of China. That do much better than that, but also we also got very bad outcome, in particular for some of the African countries, and that's a clear illustration of the fact that we don't have efficient risk sharing in our society. Okay, we should have offered in 1969. We should have collectively offered a mechanism to put a floor to the GDP per capita of the poorest country in the world, and that there are many ways to do that. So implementing GDP index sovereign bonds. Having more fiscal integration. Here I speak more about the European Union. Having more flexible immigration rules, having better foreign aids, and possibility of debt forgiveness. If we look at monetary unions like the European ones, we see that even in this a priori nice zone, we are still extremly bad in organizing efficient risk sharing. Okay, one of the basic the consequence of the mutuality principle is that when globally we are more wealthy, everybody will win from that. There could be no loser when on average we are winners. Okay, and clearly the number that you have on the second part on the bottom of the slide, you see that, of course, we know the story. I mean, Greece GDP per capita basically went down by 30% since the beginning of the crisis there. And it's so bad, it's so inefficient. Of course, we know that there are, again, moral hazard considerations that explain why, at this stage, given the fact that we have not been able to implement reforms in the economic governance of the Union, we face this problem. So we need, at the same time, to implement that kind of resolution of the risk-sharing problems through for example, what Jacques Jacques proposed, which is to have emissions of GDP index bonds by the different countries that would be purchased by the Union. But at the same time, at the top of that, we also need to have the possibility for the Union to control for the moral hazard problem that is internal to each countries. And I think this is not that should be emphasized more in the report. Okay, that's for the national view, for the international view. For a more national perspective or local perspective, let me also mention that there is so much inefficiencies in the allocation of risk in the economy that it's just a shame. I mean, it's so bad. And it's very important, and us as economists, we express this view that we need to change those things in order to not only to improve risk sharing, but also to better fight the misery of the fate of the poorest people in our society. Let me give you two examples. One not mentioned by Jacques, but I feel it's very important for a large fraction of the population. For a large fraction of the population, house is the main asset of the household. And still, there is huge uncertainty about what the value of this house, of their house, will be in 10, 20, or 30 years from now, which is something which is critical when we think about, for example, how to finance pension benefits when the pay-as-you-go system is uncertain about being able to provide the incomes for in the future. And that's surprising. That's not possible because, I mean, this is typically an example where risk sharing should be done. And clearly, there is no much correlation between the value of house and the evolution of value of house in different countries. So there is no much correlation. So risk sharing, mutualizing those risks should increase welfare by a wide margin. So international reinsurance should allow the functioning of such international sharing. Another example mentioned by Jacques in relation to our papers, most risks associated to human capital many risks associated to human capital are uncertain, and most of them are not insurable. So one way to go solving this risk-sharing problem is to have a public intervention where at the same time we modulate the minimum wage and we allow for unemployment insurance. And that's very important. And in fact, in one way or another different countries implemented that kind of thing. Imagine that, and just a quote from Jacques' document, imagine now how low wages for low-skilled workers would fall in the absence of mechanisms as unemployment insurance we have in Western world. There are many other examples of clearly inefficient risk sharing situation where the Borg theorem, the mutuality principle, and the sensitivity principle are not observed in practice. Let me give you a few examples. Well, I'm very much involved in the industry of life insurance in France. Life insurance in France is an horrible product. It's basically owned by the most wealthy people in France. That's typically a product that is sold to people who have a lot of wealth and who face the problem of transferring this wealth to their heirs without paying too much taxes. So this is typically the product that those people purchase for fiscal reason. And you know what? This 1.5 trillion euros owned by this wealthy French citizens are invested in risk-free assets. Most of it is invested in sovereign bonds, and short-term one. Maturity is less than average maturity is 5 years. So that's crazy because that are the people who should bear the macroeconomic risk. That is, they should bear should hold those equities where profits will fluctuate in parallel to the outcome of the macroeconomy. Rather, they invest in risk-free assets. So that's typically an example of risk-sharing inefficiency. And it would be so simple to change the equilibrium there, and it's not done. So I've been working on that. I've been reading newspaper articles, but with little success at this stage. Okay. So another important message contained in Jacques' presentation is that uncertainty does not only has a direct negative impact on welfare, which is, you cannot insure for many of your idiosyncratic risks. Mutualization does not work, so because of risk aversion, you are worse off. But at the same time, there are indirect effects that should also be taken into account that have important macroeconomic consequences. Okay, so different mechanisms have been presented by Jacques. One is obvious. If you cannot insure for many of your human capital risk, you will save more. Again, that's the notion of the precautionary saving motive. And so that reduces the dynamics of the economy. At the same time, more uncertainty about the future makes generate an increase in the aggregate risk premium on financial markets. Okay, and so therefore, people will be are less interested in taking risk in the society. That also reduces the growth of the economy. And Jacques add on top of that different elements. So, for example, uncertainty, parametric uncertainty in particular, generate a positive option value to delay the investment. Obviously, that reduces the growth of the economy in periods where the uncertainty increases. And more importantly, too, in these models, those economies with incomplete markets, you have multiple equilibria, and of course, the existence of multiple equilibria generate an increase of endogenous uncertainty in the sense you don't know which equilibria will be played in the future. All those things imply that not only risk is bad because of risk aversion, but risk is bad also, and incomplete market, uninsurability is bad because it reduces the dynamism of the economy, and therefore that justify another public intervention. So the social benefits of delocking risk-sharing institutions are much larger than usually believed. Okay, so I think the most important, most useful contribution of Jacques' lecture are related to the policy recommendation. And I know that Jacques has been advocating that kind of policy recommendation for a long time. And I think that has some success, but we need to do more about that, and we should try to support more that kind of initiative. So increasing aggregate demand, that's the main idea. My personal view on this, so this is not in Jacques' presentation, my personal view is that, in a sense, Jacques put a lot of emphasis on the idea to have automatic adjustment procedure. So when we anticipate a crisis coming, we should know from the beginning what will happen in the future. Okay, my view on this is that when we anticipate a recession, so when we anticipate a reduction in the growth rate of the economy, we should immediately reduce the discount rate. So suppose, and that's, I know it's quite artificial, let me suppose that in the developed world, the public sectors work efficiently, in the sense that they invest in public projects in all public projects whose net present values is positive. Okay? I know this is not completely true. I know that there are political intervention, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but suppose for now that's it. That's the case. So in that case, the crucial policy instrument is the discount rate which is used to determine which investment project have a positive social value and which investment project destroy social values. Okay? We know that it's efficient to increase the discount rate where we anticipate a larger growth of the economy. Okay, that's just a simple. There is just a simple reason for that. When the growth of the economy is large, future generation will be wealthier than us, and therefore we should less sacrifice of present welfare in order to improve the welfare of people who anyway will be better off. That's just a notion of inequality aversion. We are inequality averse, so if there is a large growth rate, we should invest less, and that should be done by increasing the discount rate. So that's natural. And the Ramsey rules says exactly that. It's socially desirable to reduce the discount rate where we have diminishing expectation about the future. The problem is currently in the level of the European Union, at the level of different countries, we have basically fixed discount rate. We change the discount rate every 10 years or something like that. So we should be much more reactive. When we anticipate a recession, when we anticipate in particular a long-lasting recession, we should reduce the discount rate, and that will have a positive automatic effect on the growth of the economy. That will generate an increase in the public demand for goods and services. Okay, and my recommendation, a simple rule of thumb would say the discount rate should be equal to 2 times the expected growth rate of the economy for the corresponding maturity you consider for your investment. Okay, the Juncker plan do something related to that. And the problem with the Juncker plan is that I don't really know how they decide what project are selected, what are the characteristics of the procedure to determine which project will be implemented or not. So my view on this is that the public sector should focus on investment project, of course, as mentioned by Jacques, who are socially desirable, that is, whose net present value take into account of all the externalities generated by the investment, and often in those public projects, many of the benefits are non-financial. They are generated by positive externalities, like reducing emission. If we think about energy transition, or generate reduction of involuntary unemployment. If we think about project in infrastructure or project in housing. So we should focus, of course, on projects which are efficient, but which are not. The private sector will not invest in, because when we don't take into account of those externalities, the purely financial net present value will be negative. So in order to do that, we need to do several things. We need to be much clearer and much more transparent on what evaluation procedure do we use at the level of the Union, at the level of the different nations, and in particular, we should put a price on all those externalities. We should value, and maybe these values may be different for Greece than for France or Germany, but we should put values on what the society should be ready to pay to save one employment, or to transfer, to make that one person who is currently on long-term spell of unemployment become employed again. That generates externalities that are not taken into account by firms themselves. We should, as a society, take into account of that, and we should value that. Same exactly as we price carbon. I've been much involved in this dimension of the problem. So we should put a price on carbon. We should put a price on putting one unemployed person on an employment position. We should put a value on. And I know that Jacques has been working on that for a long time, early in his career, but we should put a value on saving a life, a statistical life. What's the value we put? And we know for many infrastructure, for highway, when we build an highway, many of the benefits of building highways is to reduce to improve safety, road safety. So all those things we should have put a value on this. And France has been, France has a tradition in doing that, thanks to Marcel Boiteux, but I don't see really many of these applications going. I don't see the European Investment Bank prioritizing different public investment associated to the Juncker plan, doing this cost-benefit analysis. And I think that we need, in order to implement the kind of idea that Jacques has, which is to increase aggregate demand in case of recession, and by investing in efficient, 1 minute, if you accept, we need to be much more active in providing to the profession of evaluators of public investment projects the rules that will be useful to make this policy evaluation. Okay, let me finish with one thing that matters a lot for me in my research, but also I believe that it's really a question that we need to address us as a profession that we are not very good to do up to now, which is, can we agree on the income elasticity of marginal utility? Is the degree of concavity of the utility function. Oops, yes, you're right. Thank you. Too many screens. Yes. Okay, the concavity of the marginal utility, the concavity of the utility plays a very important role in many policy evaluation. Okay, because it measures risk aversion, it measures our willingness to smooth consumption over time, it measures our willingness to reduce inequalities in our society. And, when we want to calibrate a model in order to value those externalities of reducing inequalities or improving consumption smoothing or reducing risk borne by individuals, we don't know which number to use, and then there is still very much uncertainty on that. So Jacques, in his 1981 paper that he presented yesterday, I mean, only the result, suggested that we should use the relative risk, a degree of relative concavity of the utility function between 1 and 4. I think 4 is too large. Let me just explain why. I think my preference is for 2, and I think sometime we will have to have a conference where we try to a consensus conference on that. So here is, and that's my final slide. This is an experiment that I would like to have with you as a conclusion. Suppose that we could decide in which society we will live in the future. Okay, and there are 2 possibilities. In one of the 2 societies, every person who will live in that society will get either a daily income of 50 with probability 1/2, or a daily income of 150 forever all along his life. So there is a lot of inequality. I mean, the wealthy people will consume 150 and the poor will consume 50. Okay, the question is, suppose that alternatively we can switch to another society where we will have all the same level of consumption. Okay, what's the critical level of consumption in this egalitarian society, which makes you just indifferent between living in that very unequal society and the one with the egalitarian one. So Jacques, so here is the solution of what's the degree of concavity as a function of your answer. If you say that you are indifferent between living in that society where 50% of the population has 50 and the other 50% have 150, if you say I'm indifferent in living in that society or in another one where egalitarian, where everybody consumes 62, your degree of risk aversion is 4. 62, I find it very low. Okay, my preference is for 2. I believe that, I don't believe. My degree of inequality aversion or risk aversion under the will of ignorance, that's the same thing, makes me relatively indifferent between having 75 for sure or 50 or 150 with equal probability. It's just a proposal. So this, if we could solve this problem, I could tell you what's discount rate we should use, what risk premium we should impose to risky investment project, what kind of minimum wage regulation we should have, and many other things. As long as we don't have a solution to this question, we will debate about policy recommendation with little foundation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for reading my draft and preparing your comments, and I think they are welcome and inspiring, and I hope that we can discuss them further at some point. I think we should invite questions, and then I first thank, of course, Jean-Jacques and Christian for coming, but before discussing their suggestion, I think we should first hear if there are questions that need answers.
Yes, I think this is wise because it's 5:45 and we're supposed to finish at 6, so it's probably fair to give the floor to the audience. So who is willing to take the mic?
So for the question is for the first speaker, which he introduced, he emphasized the importance of introducing firms in this general equilibrium and the role of the firm. I have a question. In the current setting of the general equilibrium, is it easy to introducing firms? Because we have individuals, and firms has many scaling. And if you introducing these concepts, I mean, is the current setting will be easily incorporate this kind of concept. And another thing is the aggregation also is relating to the scale of firms and individual and groups. In the standard general equilibrium, the aggregation is basically deal with integrate or summation or this kind of stuff. Is there a better way to aggregate information, especially those heterogeneous agents and firms information in the standard, in the current situation? I mean, this is my 2 questions about the...
So I think it's extremely difficult to do this, and I think that's also exactly the reason why so little has been done. So I think you see on the one hand people focusing on corporate finance issues and emphasizing asymmetric information issues, and on the other side of the spectrum you see people looking at efficiency of financial markets and asset pricing. And you see very little on the interface of the 2 things. So I think it's very difficult to achieve this.
If I may, on this point, you heard that Jean-Jacques Herrings described briefly another way of modeling firms. I would guess that it will satisfy the weak conditions that I use in this theorem. And as I explained yesterday, I think we must allow for a wide diversity from one firm to the next. Which also brings me to the question raised by Christian. The degree of risk aversion of firms is probably more important even than the degree of risk aversion of households, I would expect some variety across firms. So are you asking for trying to build a distribution for the coefficients of risk aversion?
Well, I was... Thank you. My point was more about the public sector. I mean, what's the attitude toward risk and inequalities and consumption smoothing for a government, for the European Union? If we think about the Juncker plan, what kind of rule should we use in order to make choice in different investment projects proposed by the different members of the Union? You mean we should only fund the projects that have a positive expected contribution at the coefficient of risk aversion of the authorities? Yes, so... in particular, if a firm is less risk averse and is prepared to engage in risky projects, it should not be funded. Well, I was more contemplating a project that would not be funded by the private sector, because most of the benefits of the project correspond to externalities that are not currently priced by market for. We are talking here about second best solution. So many of those externalities. So, for example, there is no carbon price, or the carbon price on the EU ETS is way too small compared to the net present value of the climate damage generated by 1 ton of CO2. So in that case, as long as we don't have an efficient pricing of those externalities, we have a public sector who could make the investment taking into account of the real values of the externality generated by those investments. So it's basically only limit. My analysis was just for the discount rate for the public sector. But you are right. Of course, there are competition. There is crowding out effect and things like that when the private sector use different discount rate. So we both regard it as an important challenge to elicit the risk aversion of the public sector. That was reinforcing your point, yes.
Just wanted to refer to your metaphor of the multi-floor story. The ground floor is dealing with the policy making and the noise of the street, the pressure of the people, and the upper floor is basically busy with the design of the policy. I think there is something missing into that, which is the veil of ignorance. I think when you are in the ground floor, you unveil the veil of ignorance. Basically, people know some of the idiosyncratic risk, your human capital and all that, and you have to deal with these kind of voters. And you, at the upper floor, you design a policy that is supposed to be correct, welfare maximizing, under the veil of ignorance. And my question is really how we can solve this kind of conflict between the policymaker and the terrorists, those who try to help them to make the policy, but keeping this assumption that we are operating under the veil of ignorance, just in terms of risk sharing, the European level or the local level, that some of the risks are already resolved. When you are in the middle of your life and you are a voter, and basically, how you do this kind of to resolve this kind of misunderstanding, I would say, between those who are designing those nice policy, the carbon tax, all that. They make sense. They make perfect sense under the veil of ignorance. When you unveil that, does it still make sense? It is about the policy, the social acceptability of the policy. When the veil of ignorance is partially unveiled. That's my question.
I'm not sure that we have the same understanding of what is the veil of ignorance. But take an example, there would be a policy under which pensions are adjusted to economic conditions. And when we design this policy, we don't know what kind of uncertainties will prevail in the future. There may be a deep recession, there may be a wave of high prosperity, etc. Would you say that we are now making a decision behind the veil of ignorance?
For that point, yes. Yeah, for that, yes.
I am saying we are making a decision under uncertainty. Some authors, I think, use the word veil of ignorance to refer to unborn people. And the analogy here is between an unborn people whose tastes are unpredictable and a citizen today who is not part of the decision of how the pensions should be related to macroeconomic conditions.
You could also say that the decision of pension system, you could say also that the decision for the pension system would be the same whatever the generation makes the decision. So you have your own view of uncertainty now, and you make the decision, but maybe in the future generation will have another view of uncertainty that would make the same decision. So that's why you could say this is behind the veil of ignorance, in that sense. So it's
with reference to generations.
Okay, thank you, Jacques, for those lectures. So, is there something in Theorem 7.1 that could help us understand why Europe is stagnating, whereas the US... Why the Eurozone is stagnating, more or less, whereas the US economy is booming currently?
You are asking a lot for a theorem. I had a research challenge saying extend the model and the theorem 7.1 to an international setup with multiple nations. And you are asking, does the theorem as it stands, not formulated to address these situations, help explain?
But, according to my understanding, what happened in the US, according to Theorem 7.1, is that they have moved from one equilibrium to another equilibrium, right? And what is the mechanism that has pushed them from one equilibrium to the other? It could be public investment, but I don't think it has been public investment. So, I do know what you think about that.
You noted that I am inviting researchers to embed theorems on temporary equilibrium in dynamic systems to study dynamic sequence of temporary equilibria. Theorem 7.1 by itself definitely cannot explain why a country escapes recession to to return to more prosperous conditions, while another does not. So, in fact, I think the answer to your question is clear. Theorem 7.1 does not help with that issue. But the issue is interesting by itself, of course, but that's another debate.
May I add one small comment? Because you refer to public investment in the US. But one way to understand it might be that Europe has been facing additional negative shocks which the US hasn't seen. And I'm referring to Greece, Italy, Spain, sovereign debt problems which might be affecting Europe, which do not affect the US. Would be one possibility, I think.
Certainly, some countries may be more vulnerable to recession. Greece compared with Germany is one example. Europe compared to US maybe.
Is this working? Yeah. Just as a reminder, maybe should be said that basically the American financial system was bailed out by the TAR program, while Europe made the choice not to do so. So it certainly played a role in helping the US to get out of the financial recession much quicker than Europe.
Thank you to everybody, to Jacques first and to the discussants for their participation and for your presence. So you're now invited for what has been called a farewell drink, but let's call it a drink. Yes, there is. So please, let's go.